Get out, Ethan. You embarrass me.
8 years meant that little to you? Did you say Ethan Mercer? Why does this house know my name?
We found your forged will and stolen transfers.
That fortune was supposed to be mine, so you stole from a dying man. He should have chosen me. He knew I existed?
He searched for you for decades.
Then why didn't he come himself?
Because he ran out of time.
She said it the way you close an account flat, final, done. A man who fixes other people's broken buildings doesn't belong walking through that gate. Get out. Her mother didn't say a word. She just dropped my bag onto the gravel like it was something she'd been waiting to do for a long time. And then I stood there in the driveway of the largest private estate I had ever seen, watching my wife drive toward the security booth, with another man in the passenger seat that used to be mine. Not knowing that somewhere behind those iron gates something was waiting with my name on it that none of us had any idea existed. Welcome to today's story. If you enjoy emotional drama and shocking twists, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more unforgettable stories. And before we begin, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. It didn't start at those gates. It started the way most endings do, quietly, long before anyone said anything out loud. My name is Ethan Mercer. I was 40 years old, and I restored old buildings for a living. Not renovated, restored. There was a difference I had spent 15 years trying to explain to people who didn't always see it. Renovation was making something new. Restoration was finding what was still there and carefully bringing it back. Libraries with cracked limestone. Courthouses whose facades had been eaten by a century of weather. Churches whose bell towers were rotting from the inside. These were the places I spent most of my waking hours in, crouched in the dark with a flashlight and a notebook figuring out what could still be saved. My colleagues called it meaningful work. Vivian, in the last year of our marriage, called it a hobby that paid poorly. She wasn't always like that. I want to say that plainly because it is the honest truth and it matters. The woman I married 8 years ago was sharp and direct and had worked hard for everything she had. She was a real estate agent who specialized in commercial properties, and she was good at her job in the specific way that people are good at things they actually care about, rather than things they have simply decided to pursue for the income. She had a kind of focused clarity that I admired. She didn't perform anything. She just was what she was. The shift was gradual. Her professional circle expanded, and the people in it had a particular relationship to money, not as something you earned and used, but as something you displayed and compared. Vivian's mother, Denise, had always been the kind of person who tracked what other women's husbands owned, and as Vivian's career grew, Denise's influence grew with it. Small comments at first. Observations about a colleague whose husband had just made partner. A neighbor who'd purchased a second property in Charleston. The comparisons came in layers like water damage, slowly enough that you almost missed them until the structure started to shift. I watched it happen and told myself it was a phase. I was wrong about that. The morning Vivian told me about the Thornfield invitation, she was already dressed. It was a Thursday, and the light was the kind of thin and bright that October mornings get in Richmond. And she said it the way she'd been saying most things lately, with the door already halfway closed. A private viewing at the Thornfield Manor estate. The Ashford family had recently lost their patriarch, Thomas Ashford, and a small group of professional contacts had been invited for an informal gathering at the property. Her colleague Derek Ashby had arranged it. I said I would come. She paused for a beat that lasted just slightly too long before she said fine. I noticed the pause. I had been noticing a lot of pauses lately. Derek Ashby was not someone I knew well. He worked in high-end estate acquisitions and had the practiced ease of a man who had spent years making himself useful to people wealthier than himself. He met us at the car that morning with a hand already extended and a smile already arranged, and he and Vivian fell into conversation before we'd reached the end of our street. Denise sat in the back seat beside me and talked at the window about the property values in the Ravenport corridor. I watched the Virginia hills move past and thought about a church restoration I was supposed to start the following week. A small Episcopal congregation in Henrico County, late 19th century limestone foundation cracking along the east wall. I had spent 2 evenings the previous week making notes on what the repair sequence should be. The work required patience. It required knowing what the original structure was trying to do before you decided how to help it hold. I was still thinking about that when Vivian stopped the car. We were at the end of a long approach road. The iron gates of Thornfield Manor rose ahead of us, and through them I could see a stone house set far back in the landscape, not large in the showy, compensating way that new money builds, but in the particular way of things that had been built to last, and then simply stayed. There were bare elms along the gravel drive. The light moved through them in long, flat lines. Vivian turned to me. Her expression was one I had learned to recognize, calm on the surface, something harder underneath. She said she needed me to get out of the car. I looked at her. She said Derek should be in the front with her when they went through. That it would look more appropriate. That I could make my own way or wait. I didn't move right away. I was giving the moment the time it needed, the way I gave a damaged building time to tell me what it was actually saying before I decided what to do. The moment said what it was clearly enough. It had been saying it for a while. I opened the door and stepped out onto the gravel. Denise reached over and set my bag on the ground without looking at me. Derek came around the front of the car and settled into my seat. Vivian looked at me through the window and said the marriage was over. She said it in the same tone she used for things she had already finished deciding. Then she drove forward toward the gate. I stood in the gravel driveway with my bag at my feet and watched the car reach the security booth. The guard leaned out with a tablet. He scrolled. He looked up. He scrolled again. The gate did not open for Vivian's car. Instead, the gate swung the opposite direction inward toward me, and a man in a dark jacket stepped through and walked directly to where I was standing. He moved with the unhurried certainty of someone who had been doing something for a very long time and had stopped needing to think about how to do it. He stopped in front of me. He looked at my face for a moment with an expression I couldn't read. "I'm sorry to approach you like this," he said. "My name is Bernard Hale. I manage operations for the Thornfield estate." He paused. "Could I ask your full name?" I told him. "Ethan Mercer." Something changed in his face. Not much, but something. "Mr. Mercer," he said quietly, "I think you should come inside." Bernard led me through the gate and toward the eastern wing of the manor, and I followed him with my bag in my hand, and the particular hollowness of someone who has just had the last foundation. Stone knocked out from under a structure they had been maintaining for years. I wasn't thinking about the estate or the gate or the expression on Bernard's face. I was thinking about the morning 8 years ago when I decided I wanted to marry Vivian Cole. It wasn't a grand moment. That was the part I had always liked about it. We were at a hardware store in the Fan District, the old kind, not a big box chain, the kind with plank floors and bins of loose screws and a counter in the back, run by a man who had been there since the 70s. I was replacing a clamp for a restoration project in Carytown. Vivian was there buying paint for her new apartment, and she was standing in the color aisle with 2 chips held up to the light, looking at them with the same focused attention a person might give a contract they were about to sign. I didn't know her then. I just stopped because there was something in the quality of her concentration that made me stop. She wasn't performing choosing. She was actually choosing. She caught me looking and said, "You're staring." I said I was. I said she seemed to be taking this seriously. She said, "If you're going to do something, do it right." I thought that was one of the best things I had heard anyone say about anything. We talked for 40 minutes in that hardware store about restoration versus renovation, about the difference between fixing what's broken and replacing it with something easier, and by the time we left, I had her number and a specific warmth in my chest that I recognized as something worth paying attention to. We dated for a year and a half. We got married in the spring in a small ceremony in the Shenandoah Valley, with 16 people present. And I thought on that afternoon that I had married someone who understood what careful attention was for. What I didn't account for was how much a person can change when the context around them changes. The social circle Vivian moved into as her career grew was not a bad one exactly. The people in it were ambitious and organized, and many of them were genuinely accomplished. But they had a way of measuring accomplishment that I didn't share, and it became over time a kind of pressure she brought home without always realizing she was carrying it. The dinners where someone's husband had just closed a deal worth 8 figures. The neighborhood where 2 of her colleagues had recently bought second homes. The way Denise Vivian's mother always managed to arrive at the exact right moment with the exact right piece of information about what some other family had just acquired. I was not a man who owned things in the way those conversations required. I had a house in the Richmond suburbs that we'd bought together, a truck that was 12 years old and ran well because I maintained it carefully, and work that I found genuinely absorbing. I had never been embarrassed by any of it, but I had watched over several years as Vivian began to answer the question of what her husband did with a tight smile and a redirect. She wasn't lying. She just stopped volunteering the truth. There was one moment I kept coming back to in the quiet that followed arguments. It was about 6 months before the Thornfield invitation. I had come home late from a site visit and found her in the kitchen practicing something under her breath. Just repeating a phrase the way you practice something you're going to have to say in public and want to get right. When she heard me, she stopped. I asked what she was doing. She said nothing, just tired. But I heard enough to understand that she had been rehearsing how to introduce herself at a professional event. And the version she was rehearsing didn't include me. That was the moment I understood something had shifted past the point where patience was going to fix it. I hadn't left. I had kept showing up the way I had always shown up, because that was the thing I had built my idea of myself around, not walking away from something just because it was damaged. But there is a difference between a building worth restoring and one whose foundation has been replaced underneath you without your knowledge. And I think somewhere in the months before Thornfield, I had started to understand that I was working on the wrong kind of structure. Bernard walked without speaking. He had a particular quality of presence that reminded me of the older craftsmen I had worked with early in my career. People who had been doing their jobs for so long that the doing itself had become a kind of silence. We passed through a side corridor lined with framed architectural drawings. The detail in them was exceptional, the kind that suggested the original architect had understood that the building would outlast the reason for building it. I wanted to stop and look. I didn't. We came out into a long hallway with high ceilings and photographs along the left wall. Not the ornamental kind, but documentary ones. The kind that suggested someone had wanted a record of a place rather than a presentation of it. I glanced at them without stopping and registered faces, landscapes, the eastern wing under different light at different seasons. Bernard stopped at a set of double doors. "I'd like to show you something first," he said, "before we go upstairs." He opened the doors into a portrait gallery, a wide, low-lit room with perhaps 30 paintings arranged along the walls, all of them people, none of them purely decorative. The quality varied. Some were formal commissions, others looked like they had been painted by someone who knew the subject, rather than someone hired to capture them. Bernard walked me past 3 of them before stopping. "You haven't noticed yet," he said quietly. Take a look." He gestured to the portrait on the wall to my left. I looked at it. The man in the painting was in his mid-40s. He was seated with the particular ease of someone comfortable in the space he occupied, not performing it. Dark jacket, no tie. The background was the library I had not yet entered. He had a quality of stillness in the painted face that suggested the painter had known him well enough to catch it, and he had my jaw, my eyes. The exact same slight asymmetry in the brow that I had looked at in mirrors my entire life, without knowing what to make of it. I stood in front of that portrait for a long time. The name on the plaque below read, Thomas Ashford, 1958-2025. Who was he, I asked, though I already understood something was changing in the room I had been standing in my whole life. He was the owner of this estate, Bernard said, and I believe he was your father. I stood in front of the portrait and did not speak for a long time. Bernard didn't rush me. He stood to the side with the patience of someone who had been keeping this particular vigil for longer than this afternoon, and I let the silence hold because I didn't yet have words that matched what I was looking at. The resemblance was not subtle. It was the kind of resemblance that once you saw it, you could not unsee not just the jaw and the brow, but something in the quality of the expression, the way the painted face held itself in a moment of thought. I had a photograph of myself taken on a job site in Charlottesville 3 years ago, standing outside a courthouse I had spent 18 months restoring, and if you put that photograph beside this portrait and removed the context and the clothing, you would have a difficult time distinguishing the age difference from anything else. I said my father left when I was an infant. My mother never told me his name. I know Bernard said. He said it gently, as though this were a thing he had been waiting to say and was careful about the weight of it. Mr. Ashford told me. Not everything, he was a private man, but enough. When, about 2 years before he died, he had found you by then. Or rather, he had found where you were. He knew your name, your work, the city where you lived. He had been watching from a distance for quite a while. Bernard paused. He was trying to decide how to approach. He died before he resolved that. I looked at the portrait again. The eyes in it had a quality I recognized now that I understood what I was looking for. Not grief exactly, but a kind of sustained attention to something just outside the frame. The door at the end of the gallery opened, and a woman entered with the quiet purposefulness of someone who had been told exactly how much time she had. She was in her late 50s, silver-haired, wearing a dark jacket, and carrying a document folder with the kind of control that suggested she was accustomed to carrying things that mattered. She crossed the room, extended her hand, and said, "Mr. Mercer. My name is Eleanor Whitfield. I was Thomas Ashford's legal director for 22 years. I've been expecting this conversation, though I confess I didn't know exactly when it would happen. You knew I was coming, not today specifically. But Thomas's instructions were clear. If a man matching your physical description and name appeared at the estate at any point, under any circumstances, I was to be notified immediately." She glanced at Bernard. "He called me from the gatehouse." I said, "What are his instructions?" Eleanor set the folder on the narrow table against the wall and opened it. "The formal proceedings require confirmation of your identity through DNA analysis, which we can arrange this afternoon if you're willing. But I want to be honest with you before we begin. I recognized your name the moment Bernard gave it to me. Thomas kept a file. I've seen your photograph. I know who you are." She looked at me with the particular directness of someone who has spent decades managing information and has learned to be precise about when and how she gives it. "Your father was Thomas Ashford," she said. "He was the founder and sole owner of Ashford Consolidated Group, a private holding company with interests in industrial logistics, renewable infrastructure, and land management. He died 4 months ago at 66. His estate includes Thornfield Manor and its surrounding 300 acres, controlling interest in 7 private companies, a family trust with endowments in several Virginia communities, and a collection of assets that I will summarize in detail once your identity is formally confirmed. She paused. He amended his will 3 years ago. He named his biological son as sole beneficiary. I said he had no other children, no. Thomas never married. His family had a nephew, Marcus Vane, who had been managing the estate's day-to-day operations under a general power of attorney, and who had over the years positioned himself as the likely successor. Thomas's will supersedes any assumption Marcus may have made. I looked at the portrait again. The man in it didn't look like a man who had spent his life accumulating. He looked like a man who had built something and then spent a considerable amount of time wondering what it was for. Why didn't he contact me directly, I asked. If he knew where I was. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. He wrote about that in his private letters. He was concerned about how you would receive it. You had built a life. He didn't want to disrupt it. He thought there was a right way to approach you, and he was still searching for it. She closed the folder. He ran out of time. The grief that moved through me was not the kind I had any framework for. It was the specific grief of losing something you had not known you had, which is its own category of loss, harder in some ways than ordinary grief because there is no history of having it to hold on to, only the outline of what it might have been. I said I would stay. I would do the DNA test. I would hear whatever he had left. Eleanor nodded. She said there was something else that Thomas had recorded a message for me. He prepared it approximately 3 months before his death. He asked me to keep it for the moment we're now in. She looked at me steadily. But before you hear it, there is something you should know about what is happening outside. She meant the gate. Vivian's car had still been at the security booth when Bernard came to find me. The guard had confirmed there were no names on the permanent guest list, matching anyone in the vehicle. Derek Ashby's professional contact, it turned out, had been a distant relationship with a minor Ashford tenant company, not close enough to generate a standing invitation, only enough to generate the assumption of one. Your wife is being handled by our staff, Eleanor said. She is welcome to wait in the visitors area. The estate has protocols for situations where there is a legal spouse. She said it without emphasis, but I understood the weight of it. I thought about Vivian at the security booth. The particular expression I had imagined on her face when the gate opened for me, and not for her. A year ago, I might have felt something sharp about that. Standing in the portrait gallery with my father's face looking at me from the wall, I felt mostly tired. There's one more thing, Bernard said from the doorway. He had gone quiet long enough that I had nearly forgotten he was still in the room. When I walked out to the gate this afternoon and saw you standing there, I thought for a moment I was looking at a younger version of him. He said it simply, without drama. Thomas would have recognized you immediately. I looked at the portrait one more time. Then I followed Eleanor out of the gallery and up the stairs toward whatever he had left for me. Thomas Ashford's private study was on the second floor of the eastern wing at the end of a hallway where the floors changed from tile to old hardwood that creaked in a specific pattern that felt immediately familiar in the way that places sometimes do, before you understand why. Eleanor opened the door and stepped back to let me enter first. The room was exactly the kind of room someone builds when they want a place to think, rather than a place to be seen thinking. A wide oak desk near the window, its surface clear except for a brass clock and a stack of documents weighted down by a smooth river stone. Bookshelves along 2 walls actually read, not displayed with the spines worn unevenly, and several of them, facing backward, turned by someone who used them too often to bother with appearances. A fireplace with a low mantel, and above it a framed architectural drawing of Thornfield as it had looked in its original construction, dated 1903. I stood in the doorway for a moment, and felt the precise quality of a room that had been inhabited by one person for a very long time. Eleanor set a wooden box on the desk. Inside it, I could see 3 items: a sealed document envelope, a small external drive, and a compact playback device. She explained the process. The DNA sample would be collected this afternoon by the estate's medical consultant and sent for expedited analysis. Results in 72 hours. The formal proceedings for the succession would begin once the results were confirmed. In the meantime, I was free to remain at Thornfield or to come and go as I chose. Then she said he prepared this before the DNA was part of the plan. He recorded it on the assumption that you would find your way here eventually one way or another, and that you would want to hear from him before anything else. She connected the drive to the playback device and set it in front of me. "Take whatever time you need," she said. "I'll be in the adjoining room." She left. I sat down in the chair behind the desk, the chair where Thomas Ashford had sat, and pressed play. He appeared on the small screen. He was thinner than the portrait downstairs, and older in the specific way that illness makes people older, not decrepit, but stripped of something. He was seated in this same chair in this same room. Behind him were the same bookshelves, and I noticed that the river stone on the desk was in the same position it occupied now, which meant he had recorded this sitting exactly where I was sitting. He spoke without introduction, as though he had already said the preamble version of this in his head many times, and had decided to move directly to what mattered. "Your mother's name was Claire Mercer," he said. "We met in 1983 at an agricultural equipment conference in Harrisonburg. Neither of us had any business being at an agricultural equipment conference, but my company had a logistics contract with one of the exhibitors, and she was covering it for a regional paper. We talked for the better part of 2 days. I was 25. She was 23. By the time the conference ended, I understood that she was the most genuinely honest person I had met in my adult life, and I was not prepared for what to do with that." He looked at something off to the side of the camera for a moment, before looking back. "We were together for about 8 months. My family had specific ideas about who I should build my life with. Claire didn't fit those ideas in any way they were willing to discuss. My father made it clear that continuing would have consequences for the business arrangements. He was managing arrangements that were at that point the only thing keeping the company solvent. I was 25, and I was afraid of the wrong things. I told myself I could go back to her when the situation stabilized." He paused. It didn't work that way. He said that by the time the business stabilized 2 years later, Claire had moved, changed her address, stopped answering the number he had for her. He hired someone to find her and was told she had relocated to Richmond and was doing well, and that she had asked not to be contacted. He respected that. He spent the next decade telling himself it was what she had wanted. "I found out you existed through a mutual acquaintance in 2007, he said. "A woman who had known Claire in Harrisonburg told me without knowing the implications that Claire had a son who was a few years younger than he would have expected for someone her age." He stopped. I knew immediately. I did the math. I understood what I had spent 20 years not knowing. He looked directly at the camera for the first time. "I want to be clear about something. I am not telling you this because I want credit for eventually doing the right thing. I didn't do the right thing. I did a series of delayed and insufficient things over a long period of time while you grew up without a father, which is something I cannot change and would not insult you by trying to explain away." He said it evenly, without self-pity or performance. "What I can tell you is that I found out where you were living and what you were doing, and I watched your career from a distance for several years. The work you do, the restoration work, I had not told anyone about you at that point. But the first time I read an article about a project you'd completed in Charlottesville, I was proud in the specific way that people are proud of things they had no part in building, which I understand is its own kind of irony." He explained the will. The Ashford Family Trust, the controlling interests, the endowments he had established over 20 years for communities in the Ravenport corridor, most of which were places he had started investing in because they reminded him of where Claire had grown up. He said it without emphasis, as though the connection were obvious. At the end, he said, "I don't know what kind of man you are. I suspect you are the kind who would rather have been told about this directly in person while I was still available to answer for it. I agree with that preference, and I'm sorry I didn't manage to act on it in time." He looked at the camera with the same quality of attention I had seen in the portrait downstairs. Not grief, but a very sustained focus on something just outside the reach of what he could fix. "The house is yours. Everything in it. I built it for someone. I should have built it knowing who that someone would be." He reached forward. The recording ended. I sat in the chair for a long time. The grief was enormous and did not have a clean shape. It was the grief of a father I had never known, and of the mother who had kept the secret, and of all the years between. It was also, underneath all of that, the particular grief of being loved from a distance by someone who didn't know how to cross it in time. After a while, I heard a sharp knock from the room next door, and then Eleanor's voice and a different quality entered the afternoon. Eleanor came in. Her face was carefully composed. "Marcus Vane has arrived at the front entrance," she said. "He is requesting an immediate meeting with the estate attorney." She set her phone down on the desk. "He also says there has been, and I'm quoting him directly, a serious misunderstanding about the succession that requires immediate correction." I looked at the blank screen of the playback device. Then I stood up. Marcus Vane was already in the Thornfield Library when Eleanor and I came downstairs, which meant either the staff had admitted him without checking with Eleanor first, or he had walked in as though he belonged there, which I would learn was generally how Marcus operated in spaces he had decided were his. He was 47, with the particular physical quality of a man who had spent years in rooms where being the largest person mattered. He wore a blazer over an open collar and had the kind of settled confidence that can look identical to competence until the circumstances require a distinction. He was standing near the central table with one hand resting on it, and when we entered, he turned with the expression of a man expecting staff and finding something he hadn't planned for. He looked at me the way people look at objects that appear in the wrong room. Then he looked at Eleanor. "Who is this?" he said. Eleanor said, "This is Ethan Mercer. He is the individual named in Thomas's succession." Something shifted in Marcus's face. Not much. The control was good, but enough. He recovered it quickly. "I see," he said. "And on what basis has this claim been made?" "On the basis of Thomas's will, which I drafted and which is legally valid," Eleanor said. She set her folder on the table. "The formal reading is in 40 minutes. I'd ask you to wait." The library filled within the hour. Eleanor had arranged chairs in rows, and the people who assembled occupied them with the particular restraint of people who understood they were present for something significant. There were board representatives from Ashford Consolidated, 2 attorneys from the county, a financial auditor, several members of the household staff who had served under Thomas and had standing as witnesses to the estate's daily operations. And in a row near the side door, Vivian seated beside her own attorney, the paperwork already in her hands. She had dressed for this. Dark blazer hair done. She had the appearance of someone who had decided in the parking area, or perhaps earlier, how the afternoon was going to go. I found a seat toward the back, as I had in most rooms my whole life, and watched. Eleanor read the will with the methodical calm of someone who had heard it many times and understood its weight. Thomas Ashford had left the entirety of the Thornfield estate and its grounds to his biological son. He had left controlling interest in Ashford Consolidated Group and its 7 subsidiaries to the same. He had left the Ashford Family Trust including its endowment programs and community development accounts, under the direction of his sole heir with Eleanor Whitfield, named as continuing legal director to ensure continuity. He had assigned all personal property correspondence and intellectual estate to the same individual. The estimated total value of the estate was noted. I heard the number the way you hear a number that doesn't yet correspond to anything in your life, with intellectual recognition and no emotional framework. The name of the heir was read Ethan Mercer, biological son of Thomas Ashford, subject to DNA confirmation currently in process. Marcus stood up before the room had finished processing. He said the will was subject to a competency challenge he had already prepared. He said Thomas had been in declining health in the final 2 years of his life, and that the amendment naming an unknown biological son had been made under conditions that warranted scrutiny. He said he had evidence that Thomas's judgment had been compromised. He said he had standing as the existing executor and operational manager of the estate. He said all of this very quickly and very well. Eleanor listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "The competency challenge has no legal standing. Thomas was examined by 3 independent medical professionals in the 6 months prior to the amendment. All 3 assessments found him fully competent. I will be happy to provide those documents." She looked at Marcus with the precise attention of someone who has long since stopped being surprised by him. "Your standing as executor is contingent on the will as written. The will as written names Ethan Mercer as sole heir. Your operational role under the prior power of attorney terminates upon formal succession." Marcus sat down. The room absorbed this with the silence of people rearranging what they had assumed. Then Vivian stood up. She crossed to where I was seated, which required walking past approximately 30 people. She sat down in the empty chair beside me, put her hand on mine, and said, "I want to support you through this. We're still legally married. Whatever you're feeling right now, you don't have to handle it alone." I looked at her hand on mine. I removed mine. She said my name. Something in her voice shifted, the composed version dropping back for just a moment into something that might have been genuine or might have been the practiced version of genuine, and I no longer had the capacity to distinguish between them. "The marriage ended in a gravel driveway about 4 hours ago," I said quietly. "You were very clear." She started to say something else. I stood up and moved to a different seat. After the room cleared, Eleanor stayed. Bernard came back through the side door, and Eleanor asked him without raising her voice to have the server room secured. Then she turned to me. "There is something I didn't raise in the reading," she said. "Something I noticed in the past month when I was reviewing the estate's digital records." She paused, choosing the words. Marcus accessed the estate's restricted server on multiple occasions in the 90 days following Thomas's death. Files that only I and Thomas's personal accountant have authorized access to. She looked at me steadily. "I need to know what he was looking for. And I need to know if he found it before we did." Eleanor pulled the server access logs up on a laptop in the study and walked me through them with the efficiency of someone who had been reading financial documentation long enough to see the shape of things quickly. The pattern was unmistakable once you knew what you were looking at. Marcus Vane's credentials, or credentials that were his to use based on the prior power of attorney, had accessed the estate's restricted server 23 times in the 90 days since Thomas's death. The files touched were not operational, not the logistics contracts, or the property maintenance accounts, or the trust disbursement records. They were personal. Correspondence. Private legal documents. The succession amendment itself. He was reading ahead, I said. He was reading everything he wasn't supposed to read. Eleanor said. Including documents he had no business knowing existed. She clicked through to a second set of records. These were financial, the estate's minor holding accounts, 15 smaller properties and investment vehicles that sat beneath the Ashford Consolidated umbrella and were administered by a separate management company. The transfers were small individually, 30,000 here, 45 there, amounts that in the context of a multi-million-dollar estate would be easy to overlook in any given quarter. But Eleanor had mapped them against a timeline, and what emerged was not occasional movement, but systematic, regular withdrawal over 18 months, always to the same 4 receiving entities, always structured just below the threshold that would trigger automatic review. The receiving entities, Eleanor said, are shell companies. I retained a forensic accountant 6 weeks ago before the succession question became public. These 4 entities share a registered agent in Delaware, a post office box in Richmond, and a common attorney of record who has done other work for Marcus personally. I said, how much? Approximately $2.4 million. I absorbed that for a moment. Then I said, he wasn't planning to contest the will. He was planning to drain the estate before anyone noticed there was a new owner to notice. That is my assessment. Yes. The will contest may have begun as a fallback, something to buy time once he understood that a biological heir existed and that the succession was real. Eleanor closed the laptop. The contest, the server access, and the transfers are not separate problems. They are the same problem at different stages. I stood up and walked to the window. The eastern grounds of Thornfield were visible from here. Bare elms in rows along the drive, the kitchen garden to the left, still carrying the last of the season's growth, and beyond it, the edge of a stone path that curved around the south wing and disappeared into the property's interior. Bernard appeared in the doorway. He said there was something he wanted to show me if I had a few minutes. He took me through the house the way a person shows you something they've been caring for so long, they've stopped seeing it in pieces and can only present it whole. The kitchen with its original pantry intact. The second-floor sitting room where Thomas had kept a map table he used to plan the endowment investments. The back hallway where the household staff had maintained a small board of photographs, not of the estate but of the communities where Thomas's charitable programs operated. Schools in Ravenport and Walcott. A health clinic in Briley Township that had opened in 2018 with Ashford Trust funding. He cared about these, Bernard said simply. He would go and visit them. Not to be seen visiting, he wasn't interested in that. He just wanted to know whether what he was doing was actually working. I thought about the restoration projects I had spent 15 years on. The satisfaction was never in being credited. It was in walking past the building 6 months later and finding it still standing, the work holding the original structure, returned to what it had been trying to be. I asked Bernard if Thomas had been happy. Bernard was quiet for a moment. He was purposeful, he said eventually, which I think was the closest he came to happy. He knew what the estate was for. He had built it with a particular idea in mind. He looked at me with a directness that wasn't unkind. He just hadn't told the right person what the idea was. We went back upstairs. I found Eleanor in the study with the correspondence drawer open. She was removing documents one at a time and laying them in 2 columns on the desk, a sorting method carefully organized. She looked up when I came in. I found something, she said. Her voice was careful in a way that made me stop. She held up a sealed envelope. The handwriting on the outside was Thomas's. I recognized it from the letter he had recorded. But Eleanor wasn't looking at the envelope itself. She was looking at the smaller piece of paper she had found inside it, folded separately. Marcus accessed the restricted files approximately 3 weeks ago, she said. Among the files he accessed was this document, or rather the record of this document. He knew it was here. He had opened and read it. She unfolded the smaller piece of paper and held it so I could see. The handwriting was different, lighter. formed with the particular control of someone managing a physical condition that made holding a pen difficult toward the end. "This is your mother's handwriting," Eleanor said. "I've matched it to the signature on the original financial disclosure your mother signed when Thomas's family arranged her relocation in 1984. I said nothing. Eleanor set the paper on the desk carefully. "It appears Thomas had been in contact with your mother in the final year of her life, and she had been writing to him. I reached out and picked up the letter. It was dated approximately 18 months before my mother's death. It was addressed not to Thomas, not to anyone. It was addressed to me, and it began, 'Ethan, I have been trying to decide how to start this for 6 months. The truth is I don't know the right way to tell you something I should have told you years ago, and I'm afraid that by the time I find the right words, I will have run out of time.'" I read my mother's letter twice before I put it down. Eleanor had left the room without being asked, which was the kind of intelligence I was beginning to associate with her as a general trait. The door closed behind her with the particular softness of someone who understood that the privacy she was giving me was not a courtesy, but a necessity. My mother had been a quiet woman, in the way that people become quiet when they have been carrying something heavy for a long time, and the carrying has become so habitual they no longer recognize it as effort. She was warm. She was careful. She had a particular way of looking at me when she was about to say something important. A slight pause, a gathering of herself that I had grown up attributing to thoughtfulness and now understood as rehearsal. She had been rehearsing this conversation my entire life. The letter was 4 pages, written in the careful, slightly uneven hand she'd developed in her last 2 years when the rheumatoid arthritis in her right hand had progressed enough to make long writing sessions painful. She had written it anyway. She explained what had happened in 1983 and 1984, the same events Thomas had described in his recording, but from her side, which was different in the ways that all accounts of the same event are different when told by 2 different people who were both harmed by it. Thomas's family had not approached her kindly. There had been a meeting she had not understood was coming in an office in Harrisonburg with Thomas's father and an attorney, and a woman she later understood was Thomas's family's financial administrator. They had been clear about the conditions under which she would be welcome to stay in the community. They had been equally clear about the conditions under which she would receive enough money to relocate and build a stable life elsewhere. She had been 24 years old and 2 months pregnant, and she had not yet told Thomas. And the people in that room had already known. She wrote, "I told myself for years that I took the money because I was afraid, and that was partly true. But the fuller truth is that I was also angry at Thomas for not being there when it happened. Angry at myself for loving someone who let his family make that choice for him, and angry at the world for being organized the way it was organized. I told myself that if I was going to build a life by myself, I was going to build it entirely by myself. That your life would be entirely our own. That nothing they had would touch you." She had done that. She had built a life. She had raised me in Richmond, not far from where Thomas had grown up, which she acknowledged with a dryness I recognized as her humor emerging even in a letter she was writing in pain. She had worked as a proofreader for a legal publishing firm for 20 years and had been meticulous about money and had given me stability and a home and the specific quality of a childhood that was not remarkable in any external way, but was, she wrote, the thing she was most proud of. She had reconnected with Thomas 8 years before her death through a mutual contact she had initially refused to engage with, and then slowly had not refused. They had written letters, actual letters, not email, for several years before she died. Not romantic correspondence. Something more complicated. 2 people in their 60s trying to account honestly for decisions made in their 20s and the decades of consequence that had followed. Thomas, she wrote, had been asking her for permission to contact me. She had said she wasn't ready. She had said she wanted to be the one to tell me. First, she didn't want me to learn about my father from my father before I had learned about him from her. She had been working toward that conversation when her health declined more quickly than expected. The letter was never finished. The last paragraph ended mid-sentence. She had written, "What I want you to know before I tell you anything else is that I loved your father in the way that you love the first person who makes you feel genuinely seen. That love didn't survive what happened to it, but it was real, and you are." And then it stopped. I held the unfinished page for a long time. Eleanor came back in after a while and sat quietly in the chair by the window. I didn't need to explain to her what I was feeling, because she had spent 22 years working for a man who had been carrying the same loss from the other direction. And I think she recognized it the way you recognize the shape of something you have been living alongside. I said she was going to tell me. "Yes," Eleanor said. Both of them were waiting for the right moment. "Yes." Neither of them made it. "No," she said. They didn't. I folded my mother's letter carefully and put it in my jacket pocket beside Thomas's. Two unfinished things together. Eleanor said, "There's something else." She reached into the folder on the desk and retrieved a printout the server access log for Marcus's most recent session 3 weeks ago. The document he had opened and read was logged by file name C. Mercer, letter sealed. "Marcus read your mother's letter," I said. "He accessed it, yes. The document itself is a scan." The original was in a sealed envelope in Thomas's private correspondence drawer, which he could not physically access. But the digital scan was in the restricted files, along with Thomas's full correspondence archive. She looked at the log. "He knew your mother had been in contact with Thomas. He knew she had written you a letter. He knew what it meant for the succession. I understood what that meant." Marcus had known for 3 weeks that there was a mother's letter that corroborated everything, that confirmed the relationship between Thomas and Claire was genuine, that the biological connection was real, that the succession amendment had not been made in confusion or compromise, but in full understanding of what Thomas was doing. He had not used that information to accept the situation. He had used it to accelerate his plan. Eleanor's phone buzzed on the desk. She looked at it. "Marcus's attorney has contacted the county court," she said. "He has filed an emergency petition for a temporary injunction on the succession proceedings, citing a claim that Thomas's will amendment was made under undue influence." She set the phone down. "He is also submitting a codicil he claims Thomas signed in August of last year, reinstating Marcus as primary beneficiary." She looked at me. "The codicil doesn't exist," she said evenly. "I drafted every amendment to that will. There was no document signed in August of last year. Whatever he has submitted is a forgery." She stood up. "We have until 9 o'clock tomorrow morning to respond." Eleanor and I spent the rest of that evening going through the restricted server contents, systematically, not the files Marcus had accessed, but everything around them, the full picture of what Thomas had been building and what had been happening to it since his death. The financial forensics were detailed in a way that suggested Eleanor had been building this case for longer than the week since she'd decided to bring in an accountant. The 4 shell entities that had received the transfers were registered in Delaware with identical corporate formation dates, suggesting they had been created together as part of a single plan. The receiving accounts in each entity were controlled by the same signatory authority, a name I didn't recognize but that Eleanor identified as Marcus's personal attorney from unrelated correspondence. $2.4 million moved in increments over 18 months, designed to look like operational expenses and management fees. The amounts were consistent with legitimate estate administration costs on their face. Only the pattern, the regularity, the destination, the timing against Marcus's access logs revealed what they actually were. He started the withdrawals 14 months before Thomas's death, Eleanor said. He wasn't hedging against a succession he hadn't planned for. He was anticipating it. He knew Thomas had amended the will. He didn't know who the biological son was yet, but he knew there was one. She closed the accounting file. He was extracting what he could before the situation resolved itself. I sat with that for a moment. The thing about working in old buildings was that you learned to read evidence of long-term behavior. Water damage didn't happen in a night. Structural drift happened over years. You could look at the pattern of deterioration and understand the history of what had been neglected, and for how long. What Eleanor was showing me was not different in kind. It was a record of someone treating something that wasn't theirs as though the question of ownership had already been settled in their favor. The second problem came at 10:30 that night. Vivian's attorney had filed a formal notice of intent to pursue a spousal claim on the Ashford estate holdings, citing Virginia community property provisions, and the argument that since the succession had been announced, while Ethan Mercer was still legally married, and since the estate constituted a significant financial event occurring during the marriage, it should be subject to equitable distribution proceedings. Eleanor's assessment was that the claim had no realistic legal merit. Virginia did not have community property law in the way the filing implied, and an inheritance received during a marriage was explicitly excluded from marital property in most applicable interpretations. But the filing created a procedural complication. It required a response, and it tied Ethan's ability to act on the succession to a family court schedule that now ran parallel to the injunction proceeding. She is not trying to win this claim, Eleanor said. She is trying to create enough legal friction that Marcus has room to maneuver. Are they coordinating? Eleanor was quiet for a moment. I don't know. It may simply be that two people who both want something found the same window at the same time. She looked at me. Either way, the effect is the same. I stood up and walked to the fireplace. The brass clock on the mantel was wound. Bernard had wound it that morning. I would learn the same way Thomas had wound it every evening, a small continuity he had maintained since Thomas's death. Because it was the kind of continuity that cost nothing and meant something. I thought about Thomas sitting in this room, working through something difficult in the same way I was working through something now. And I thought about what the difference was between a man who built something to protect what mattered to him and a man who built something to protect his position. Thomas had built the endowments. He had funded the school in Ravenport and the clinic in Briley Township, and 20 years of small, sustained investments in communities that had no relationship to his bottom line. He had done this because he believed the estate's resources were for something. Marcus had used the estate's resources because he had decided they were his. I said, "What happens to the endowments if Marcus succeeds?" Eleanor looked up. "The trust's endowment programs are structured separately," she said. "They are legally distinct from the succession. In theory, Marcus could not touch them." She paused. In practice, an illegitimate executor with operational control could create significant delays in disbursements. Programs that operate on annual grants could miss funding cycles. Some of them are small enough that a missed cycle would cause real harm. I said, "How many people do the programs serve?" She told me. The number was not abstract. I turned from the fireplace and said, "What do we need to do by morning?" We worked until 2 a.m. The county court response required a formal affidavit from Eleanor, attesting to the will's valid execution, supported by the 3 physician assessments from Thomas's final 6 months. The forensic accountant's preliminary report on the shell entity transfers needed to be completed and attached as supporting material. The authentication documentation for the DNA analysis, already in process, needed to be expedited and its timeline confirmed. Eleanor also wanted to request a server forensic review, an independent analysis of what devices had accessed the restricted files and when. The authentication metadata on the alleged codicil she believed would reveal when the document had actually been created and on what device. That analysis would take longer, but even the request for it filed with the court would signal to Marcus's legal team that the fraud was already visible. Around midnight, Eleanor said something she had been holding for a while. Marcus's most important advantage right now is the public narrative. He has told 2 journalists a version of events in which you are an opportunist who appeared after Thomas's death with a manufactured biological claim and no prior relationship. Those pieces will run in the morning. She looked at me. You have a choice about how to respond to that. I said, what are my options? You could engage publicly. Tell your side of the story. You have a compelling one. She paused. Or you could say nothing, let the legal process carry it, and accept that for some period of time, a significant number of people will believe a version of you that is incorrect. I thought about my mother's letter in my jacket pocket. I thought about what she had built and how quietly she had built it. I said, we focus on the legal process. We don't perform anything. Eleanor nodded once, as though this were the answer she had expected and had been waiting to hear. We filed the response at 8:57 the next morning. 40 minutes later, Marcus's attorney requested an emergency board hearing at Thornfield. Eleanor accepted on behalf of the estate. She told me the hearing would be the following morning. She also told me that Vivian's family court appearance had been scheduled for the same morning at the same time across town. We stood in the hallway of Thornfield's East Wing with that information between us for a moment. I'll handle the board hearing, Eleanor said. You should be at the family court. I said, what if he makes a move at the board that requires me there? Then we deal with that when it happens, she said. But you are not going to have a judge look at this estate matter and wonder why the heir chose a board meeting over a family court appearance. That is not the story you want written about you. She was right. I went upstairs, sat in Thomas's study for a while, and read the rest of my mother's letter by the light of the desk lamp. Then I laid the letter carefully on the desk beside Thomas's 2 sheets of paper that had been waiting in different places for the same person to find them, and I tried to get a few hours of sleep before morning. The family court was in Richmond, a 40-minute drive from Thornfield in morning traffic, and I made it with 12 minutes to spare. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, a county-level family court with institutional furniture and the particular smell of rooms where difficult conversations happen regularly enough that the difficulty has become architectural. Vivian arrived with her attorney, a woman named Patricia Rowe, who had the focused composure of someone who intended to make this harder than it needed to be. I had retained an attorney the night before, a property and family law specialist in Richmond named David Chen, whom Eleanor had worked with previously on an estate matter. He was methodical and spoke quietly, and had the quality I most appreciated in people who worked in the built environment. He understood that the structure mattered more than the performance. Vivian looked at me when she came in. It was a longer look than I expected. Not calculated, something closer to assessment, as though she were trying to determine which version of me she was dealing with, the one she had known for 8 years, or the one that had walked through the Thornfield gates. I looked back at her without performance. The hearing was straightforward in its legal dimensions. Vivian's claim was that the Ashford estate disclosed during the course of our marriage constituted a financial event subject to equitable distribution. Her attorney laid this out competently. David responded by presenting Virginia's inheritance exclusion principles and the specific legal distinction between marital property and inheritance received by one spouse, a distinction that was settled law and left Vivian's claim without a realistic basis. But the legal part was not the part I had been thinking about. When the judge asked me to confirm the relevant facts of our marriage and the circumstances of the inheritance disclosure, I answered precisely and without embellishment. I confirmed the marriage. I confirmed the date of separation, the day at the Thornfield Gate, which I described factually without adjectives. I confirmed that I had not known about the inheritance prior to that day. I confirmed that the inheritance had not been concealed from Vivian during the marriage, because I had not known about it during the marriage. The judge asked whether I was seeking any financial claims against Vivian in return. I said no. She asked whether I was seeking any professional or reputational damages related to the public events of the past several days. I said no. She asked whether I was contesting any aspect of the marital assets as they had been disclosed in the preliminary filing. I said no. Whatever she was entitled to from the years we had shared, she was welcome to it. Vivian's attorney objected that this posture was evasive. The judge told her it was not evasive, it was an answer. What happened next was small and might have gone unnoticed by anyone who wasn't looking for it. Vivian leaned over to her attorney and said something quietly. Patricia Rowe listened, looked at the papers in front of her, and then told the judge that her client wished to withdraw the claim on the Ashford estate holdings pending further legal consultation. She said this carefully in the language of someone who has realized the case they came to court to argue is weaker than they had planned for. The judge noted the withdrawal for the record. Outside in the hallway afterward, Vivian stopped me by the door. Not dramatically, just stepped into the path in a way that required me to stop or walk around her, and I stopped. She said I didn't know. About your father. About any of it. I said I believed her. She said I still shouldn't have done what I did at the gate. I said no. You shouldn't have. She looked at me for a moment, with the particular expression of someone who has prepared several versions of what to say next and realized that none of them is adequate to the situation. I said, I hope you figure out who you are without what other people own. I mean that. She didn't say anything. I walked out. My phone rang on the way to the car. It was Eleanor. She said the board hearing had gone well. She had presented the financial forensics. The shell entity transfers the device metadata, connecting Marcus's server breach to the device used to create the forged codicil, and the room had gone quiet, in the way rooms go quiet when the people in them are revising what they thought they understood. One of the board members who had been aligned with Marcus had asked partway through Eleanor's presentation whether he could leave the room for a private conversation with his attorney. Eleanor had said of course. He had not returned. His formal resignation from the board had been received by email at 11:43 that morning. The hearing continues tomorrow morning, Eleanor said. Marcus has not withdrawn the injunction, but his legal team requested a recess, and they haven't been responsive since. A pause. I think they are deciding whether to proceed. I asked her what she thought Marcus would do. I think he knows the forensics are clear, she said. The question is whether he is calculating that a contested hearing gives him something he can use, or whether he has already decided that withdrawal is less damaging than exposure. She paused again. I think he'll come tomorrow. I think he still believes he can manage the room. I drove back to Thornfield in the late afternoon light, which was falling in the long, flat lines of early October through the elms. And I thought about what my mother had written, that she had made the choices she made because she was angry and afraid and 24 years old, and that she had spent the rest of her life building something out of those choices that was more than the choices themselves. I understood that. The building was what mattered. The work after the damage. I was going to finish this. I was up before 5, the morning of the board hearing. I spent the early hour in Thomas's study, not reviewing anything. Eleanor had everything she needed, and was more prepared than I could add to, but simply sitting in the chair and reading what Thomas had written in the private journals Bernard had shown me the previous afternoon. Not the formal correspondence or the legal documents, but the notebooks he had kept for himself. They were the kind of writing a person does when they are not performing for anyone, which meant they were disorganized and repetitive and occasionally contradictory in the way that honest thinking is. He wrote about the endowments in terms of what they were trying to correct, not in terms of what they cost. The school in Ravenport had come out of a period in the 1990s when he had driven through that county to visit a logistics operation and had passed a building he recognized as a school that looked like it had been maintained to the minimum standard required by law and nothing further. He had made a call that afternoon. The endowment had taken 3 years to structure properly. He wrote, "The test of whether something is worth doing is not whether it looks impressive from the outside. It is whether it holds up from inside when no one is watching." I had made the same argument in different words about restoration work. I had made it to Vivian once at a dinner party in our 3rd year when someone had asked what the point was of spending 18 months restoring a courthouse that could have been demolished and replaced in 6. I had said the building was built by people who believed it was worth building carefully. What you're asking is whether their belief was wrong. And I don't think it was. Vivian had changed the subject. I put the journal down and held the brass clock for a while. The way Bernard had told me Thomas held it when he was working through something. It was a simple clock, good mechanics, plain case, and it ticked with the particular steadiness of something that had been wound reliably for a very long time. Bernard brought me coffee at 7 and sat for a few minutes. He said, "You handled the family court well. Word travels." I said I hadn't done anything particularly brave. He said, "You didn't go in there trying to win more than you were owed. That's not as common as it should be." He looked at the clock in my hands. Thomas would have approved. I set the clock back on the mantel. The board meeting convened at 9 in the formal meeting room on the 1st floor of the West Wing, a long space with a table that seated 20 and windows looking out over the eastern lawn where the morning frost was still on the grass. 14 board members were present, plus Eleanor and her 2 associates, 2 independent auditors, and 3 attorneys from Ashford Consolidated's outside counsel. Marcus arrived with 4 people, his attorney, 2 associates, and a financial advisor I didn't recognize. He came in without looking at me and took a seat at the side of the table, not the head which I registered as a calculation. He was positioning himself as a participant in a collective process rather than as the focal point of it, which meant he had thought carefully about how he wanted to be perceived today. Eleanor opened by presenting the succession documentation, the will as executed, the DNA confirmation results that had arrived that morning. A match at the highest confidence threshold the analysis allowed, and the 3 physician assessments confirming Thomas's competency at the time of the amendment. She presented them without emphasis as a matter of record. Then she moved to the alleged codicil. She said, "The document submitted by Marcus Vane to the county court on the evening of October 11th, purporting to be a codicil to Thomas Ashford's will signed on August the 4th of last year, does not exist in Thomas's actual legal record. I drafted every amendment to that will. No such codicil was prepared, reviewed, or signed. I will now present the forensic analysis of the submitted document." She put the analysis on the screen. The forensic firm had worked through the night. The authentication metadata on the document file showed a creation date of October 10th of this year, 2 days before it was filed with the court, and 14 months after the date the document purported to bear. The file had been created on a device with a specific hardware identifier. That hardware identifier matched the device that had accessed the restricted estate server 23 times in the 90 days following Thomas's death. The same device. The same person. A board member named Leonard Farr raised his hand. He said, "The device that accessed the server is that device traceable to a specific individual." Eleanor said, "The server access was authenticated using a credential set that was issued under Marcus Vane's power of attorney. The credential was never revoked after Thomas's death because the power of attorney termination was pending the formal succession proceedings." She paused. "The hardware identifier and the credential access together create a clear attribution chain." Leonard Farr nodded slowly. Across the table, another board member, Sandra Miele, who had been quiet since the hearing opened, said, "I'd like to ask Mr. Vane directly. Is there a reasonable explanation for these findings that the board should hear before proceeding?" The room went still. Marcus looked at Sandra Miele with the expression of a man who has been waiting for a question he can answer and has just been asked one he cannot. He said, "My attorneys are evaluating the forensic methodology." Sandra Miele said, "That's not what I asked." The silence that followed lasted approximately 6 seconds, which is a very long time in a room of people who are all paying attention. Eleanor set a final document on the table. She said, "I'd like to present the financial records from the 14-month period beginning with Thomas Ashford's death. Specifically, the transfers from the estate's minor holdings accounts to 4 shell entities controlled through a common registered agent and signatory authority in the total amount of approximately $2.4 million. She distributed the summary pages to each board member. The full forensic accounting is available upon request. The preliminary report has already been shared with the appropriate regulatory bodies. The room had been quiet before. It was quieter now. Marcus's attorney leaned over and spoke to him in a voice too low to hear from where I was sitting. Marcus listened with the stillness of someone who has just had the shape of the available options confirmed for them in a way they had hoped would not be necessary. Then the attorney stood up and addressed the room. He said that, in light of the ongoing forensic analysis and the questions that had been raised about the submitted codicil's authentication, his client was withdrawing the emergency injunction petition from the county court proceedings, effective immediately pending further review of all relevant documentation. He said it in the careful language of legal withdrawal, not an admission, not an acknowledgement, simply a decision to stop proceeding in a particular direction. The kind of language that is designed to keep doors open on the speaker's side while appearing to close them for everyone else. Eleanor received the withdrawal without expression. Leonard Farr said from his seat at the table, "I'd like to note for the record that the board has not been presented with any response to the financial transfer question." The attorney said his client was not prepared to address that matter in this forum. Leonard Farr said, "Then we'll address it in the forum where it will be addressed." He made a motion. The board voted on it. Marcus Vane was to be formally removed as a state executor, effective immediately pending the completion of the forensic accounting and the regulatory referral already in process. His access to all Ashford consolidated systems and accounts was suspended. The motion required a 2/3 majority. It passed with all but the 2 members who had previously aligned with Marcus, and one of those abstained rather than voting against. The second motion was for the formal recognition of Ethan Mercer as sole heir of the Ashford estate and chair of the Ashford Family Trust, subject to the formal legal proceedings, which Eleanor confirmed were on track for completion within the statutory period. The vote was unanimous. Marcus left with his legal team without speaking. He did not look at me as he went. I thought about what that cost him, not the estate or the position or the access, but the specific cost of being a person who had spent decades positioning themselves in a room that turned out to belong to someone else. I didn't feel satisfied about it. I felt the particular tiredness of having watched something consume itself. After the board cleared, Eleanor stayed. Bernard came back in. A board member I hadn't spoken to yet approached a woman named Patricia Solis, who had served on the Ashford board for 12 years under Thomas and had throughout the morning maintained a specific quality of neutral attentiveness. She extended her hand, and I shook it. She said, "Thomas mentioned you once. He didn't say your name, he was careful about that, even with the board. But he said, 'my son,' in the context of a conversation about why the endowments were structured for long-term sustainability rather than short-term visibility." She paused. He said, "And I remember this exactly because it seemed important to him that the right person would understand why something is worth keeping without needing it to be impressive." She looked at me with the directness of someone who has spent years in rooms where flattery is currency and has stopped dealing in it. He was right. I thanked her. She shook Eleanor's hand and left. Bernard found a chair and sat down for the first time all morning. He looked like a man who had been waiting for something for a long time and was allowing himself now to stop waiting. Eleanor organized her materials into the document folder with the efficiency of someone who was already thinking about the next step. She said the regulatory referral was with the Virginia Attorney General's office and would proceed on its own timeline. The civil liability question for the shell entity transfers was a separate matter and would take longer to resolve. The two board members who had aligned with Marcus, the one who had resigned by email the day before, and the one who had abstained, were no longer board members and would not be involved in any proceeding connected to the estate. She said Vivian's spousal claim had been formally withdrawn in the county court that morning, which I already knew, and that the divorce proceedings would proceed under standard Virginia family law without any Ashford estate involvement. She said the DNA confirmation combined with Thomas's recorded message, the sealed family document, the correspondence between Thomas and Claire, and Thomas's private notation in his journals referring to his son constituted a complete and legally sufficient evidentiary record of the succession. She said, "You are legally and formally Thomas Ashford's son and the heir to this estate." I said I understood. She said he would have been glad to know this happened. I looked out the window at the eastern lawn. The frost had burned off. The elms along the drive were bare and still in the late morning light. Bernard pressed something into my hand. A small brass key, unremarkable, the kind of key that might go to a drawer or a box. His private correspondence drawer, Bernard said. The one in the study. He kept it locked while he was alive. He looked at me. "Eleanor thought you should have it." I held the key. I thought about the Henrico County Church I had been scheduled to start the following week. The limestone foundation, the east wall, the cracking that needed to be addressed from the inside before the outside could hold. I had been doing that work my whole adult life, finding the place where the damage started, working backward to understand what had shifted, then doing the careful thing of bringing it back. I thought about what my father had built, and what it was for, and what it was going to take to keep it being what it was for. I thought about the letter in my jacket pocket, both of them, and I thought that whatever else had happened in the past several days, I was no longer a man who did not know where he came from. That was not a small thing. That was, in fact, the most important thing that had happened. The brass key fit the lowest drawer of the desk in Thomas's study. I opened it the evening after the board hearing, when the house had settled into the particular quiet of a place that has been through something and is resting in the aftermath. The drawer contained 3 items: a rubber band around a small stack of photographs, a single sealed envelope addressed in Thomas's handwriting, Ethan in the careful, compressed hand I recognized from the recording, and beneath both a pocket watch I didn't understand the significance of, until Bernard told me later that it had belonged to Thomas's father, the man who had started the Ashford family's first small freight operation in 1947. I set the photographs and the watch aside and opened the letter. My father's handwriting was smaller on the page than I expected, but steady. He had written in the deliberate way of someone who had composed this many times in his head before putting pen to paper. He wrote, "I don't know if you will read this while I am still alive or after. I am writing it now because I have been told by people I trust that I am running out of time in a way I cannot argue with, and I would rather put these words on paper imperfectly than not put them on paper at all." He wrote about my mother first. He wrote about the specific quality she had, her honesty, the way she spoke when she was trying to say something she hadn't fully worked out yet, the way she listened when she had decided someone was worth listening to. He wrote about the conference in Harrisonburg and what he understood about himself in the months after she left, that he had been afraid of the wrong things, that he had let fear and his family's pressure do something to his life, that he had spent the rest of his life trying to correct without ever quite reaching the correction. He wrote, "I am not asking you to forgive me. Forgiveness is yours to give or withhold on whatever terms make sense to you, and I mean that without reservation. What I want to tell you is something different. I want to tell you that I loved your mother genuinely, and that whatever she built with a real person's help in the beginning, and the person was worth something, whatever he failed to do with it later." He wrote about finding me, about the private investigator's report in 2007, a photograph, a brief summary, the neighborhood in Richmond, where I was living, the restoration firm I had been working for. He had kept the photograph in the drawer. It was one of the photographs I would find in the rubber band, a grainy print of me on a job site in Charlottesville, taken from a distance, standing in front of the restored courthouse facade, looking up at the cornice I had spent 6 weeks on. He wrote, "I looked at that photograph for a long time. I had a person in front of me who had built something worthwhile with his own hands, in a world that had not done him any particular favors, and I understood that I had nothing to offer him except the truth of where he came from and what I had built, with the hope that it would eventually reach the right person." He wrote about the endowments, about what they were for, and why he had structured them the way he had, not for the visibility, but for the sustainability. Because the communities they served didn't need someone to arrive with a large check and a press release. They needed something that would still be there 20 years later. He wrote that he had always hoped the person who would carry that work forward would understand the difference between building for presence and building for permanence. He wrote, "The house is yours, everything in it. I need you to know that I did not build Thornfield to leave it to the most appropriate legal successor. I built it for a specific person I had not yet found. When Eleanor finds you, and she will find you, I want you to understand that the person this was built for is you." The letter ended with a sentence he had underlined, which was not something he did elsewhere in the letter. He wrote, "I am glad you exist. I am proud of what you built, even though I had no part in building it. I hope you find something in this house worth keeping." I put the letter down and held it for a while. Then I folded it and put it in my jacket pocket with my mother's, the 2 unfinished things complete now, not because they had resolved everything, but because they had said what they needed to say, and the person they were written for had read them. The weeks that followed were not dramatic. The formal succession was processed through the appropriate legal channels, which took time and required documentation, and produced no memorable moments, only the steady accumulation of things going the way they were supposed to go. Marcus Vane faced civil proceedings for the misappropriated funds and a separate referral for the document forgery. His attorney negotiated a settlement arrangement that was, Eleanor told me, substantially less favorable than what a full court proceeding would have produced for him. The 2 former board members did not contest their departures. The regulatory referral proceeded on its own timeline. Vivian and I completed the divorce through our attorneys in a process that was orderly, if not warm. She received what she was entitled to from our shared life. She did not receive access to the Ashford estate or its holdings. She did not ask for a final conversation, and I did not seek one. The last thing she had said to me in the courthouse hallway seemed, in retrospect, like the most honest thing she had said to me in several years, and I chose to remember it that way. Denise, I heard through Bernard's contact with the household staff of two of her acquaintances, had found that the social invitations, which had come with being Vivian Mercer's mother, were no longer being extended. She had not dropped a bag on a gravel driveway in front of anyone who had forgotten it. 3 months after the board hearing, Patricia Solis, who had stayed on the board and was becoming someone I genuinely relied on for her institutional knowledge, told me that the board had stabilized faster than anyone had expected. She said the thing that had made the difference was not the legal resolution, but the way I had conducted myself in the boardroom specifically, that I had come in and told them what I had done wrong before telling them what Marcus had done wrong. I said I had been trying to be accurate. She said that's what made it work. I kept the house in Richmond. I went back most weekends. I had taken on a new project, not a commercial contract, but a consultation role on a small Episcopal church in Henrico County that had been sitting on my schedule when everything changed. The limestone foundation on the east wall, the cracking that needed to be addressed from the inside. I went out there on 3 consecutive Saturdays with a notebook and a flashlight and did the work of understanding what was happening to the structure before I decided what to do about it. And then there was the church on the Thornfield property. It sat on the south edge of the estate grounds, a small stone chapel from the early 1900s that had not been actively used in decades, but had been maintained by Bernard's staff in the careful, minimal way that people maintain things they believe are worth keeping, even when they don't know exactly why. Thomas had written about it in his journal. He had intended to restore it fully. He had never gotten to it. I spent a morning walking through it with Bernard in late November. The structure was sound underneath the surface deterioration. Good original stonework, solid foundation, the roof needing replacement, but the bones holding. The interior had the quality of a place that had been empty long enough to become peaceful rather than sad. I put together a restoration plan over a weekend. Not a contractor's plan, though I would bring in the right people for the work I couldn't do alone. A restorer's plan, what was original, what needed to come back, what needed to be done in what order, and what would be left when the work was finished. On the first morning, I brought scaffolding onto the Thornfield grounds. I climbed to the 2nd level early before the crew arrived, and sat in the cold air with the estate below me and worked on the first piece of the east wall. Bernard came out from the house a while later and stood below with his hands in his pockets and watched. This was always his intention. He said loud enough to carry up to the scaffolding. I said I know. He would have liked seeing someone up there. I kept working. The light came through the bare elms along the drive in long, flat lines, the same light that had been coming through those elms every October for 100 years, and the stone under my hands was cold and solid, and had been waiting to be worked on for a very long time. That was where I belonged. Not in the portrait gallery or the boardroom or the county courthouse. Up here doing the work, making something hold. If you've ever wondered what it means to belong somewhere you never knew existed, leave a comment below. I'd love to hear what you think.